Okay, so you guys, I was just thinking again, I'm thinking from the undergrads that we teach, Joya comes and does this amazing talk on accompaniment, and she lays out, basically, um, she does this thing. I mean, she's so artful about it, so I can't even lay it out. I was hoping she would write about this in her book, but she does this thing where she talks about Jon Snow, and we could refer to this in an introduction, but she talks about Jon Snow and how, this famous public health thing is that, that he maps out where the cholera epidemic's taking place, and then takes off the handle for the Broad Street pump. And she said, but when you take the handle off the pump, where do people get water?
Mm.
They still go to the river, right?
Mhm.
And so the Thames, I'm assuming. And then she lays out that it's not enough to just take the handle off the pump. You have to be thinking about how people are going to actually live their lives and do what they need to do and to get water and cook and all these things. And very poor people still need water too. So taking the handle off the pump doesn't solve the problem. And then she goes into a lot about, how you actually are supposed to be thinking about all this. And she does a really good job about that. So as I was thinking about this, and I'm about to tell you something that doesn't match what Joya said, but I was thinking, like, what are the themes that come out in the book? And they don't have to be in this order, but I was thinking there is this idea that this is tied into some moral frame of how we should be acting to each other. And Aaron alludes to this in the religious and secular roots, right? And then I was thinking that there's this other thing that comes out, and Arlene, you've now asked us to put this in the title, but it's that walking with.
Mhm.
And what does it mean in a practical sense? And you actually bring that out. So it means something in a practical sense as you talk about it, but also it comes out in the mesh example, it comes out in the Nepal example, it comes out in the Russia example, right? And then so there's this religion and secular roots of what it means to be human and behave a certain way. Ubuntu talks about that, Hinduism talks about that, etc. There's the walking with, which is part of the practical aspect. Then there's the trust, you
Mhm.
know, that the recipient must see and feel and experience that you're acting in their best interest, right? And you bring that up, and Ellen brings that up. And then I thought the other aspect that comes out of this is that you can't approach somebody in a meaningful way without being mindful of who they are and what their history is.
Mhm.
And that's the other thing that, because that means like learning about the person in some way, and then knowing who they are. It's the opposite of what modern medicine is today, right? Where you just come and, it's whatever, it doesn't matter who you are, you get a prescription whether you speak English or not, that's in English, like this, the whole, that whole thing. So the mindful of history. And the Nepal example touches on that, as do a lot of what we're all saying, but the Nepal example touches on it. And then the other theme that came out for me was the the fact that accompaniment is not just at one level; it occurs at multiple levels. It occurs at the level of people receiving care. It occurs at the level of people giving care. That's the teaching part. It occurs at the level of organizations, right? So
Mhm.
that's what Ellen talks about, and I talk about, you
Mhm.
know, um, and even Michael. And then the next theme that came out to me was that whole caregiving thing. Paul, in one of his lines in these interviews, says he doesn't use these exact words, but he says it's sort of, this is sort of the countervailing force, the counter narrative to basically the economic the economicization of this whole thing, like of caregiving, and to, it's kind of like it's the countervailing ideology to that. And so I was thinking we could talk about how it's linked to these ideas of dignity and mercy and caregiving and recognition of shared humanity. And again, almost everything that we're talking about in the teaching, and then the examples from Haiti all the way to Durban talk about that. And then
Mhm.
I thought that, we could, and then also the classrooms and the clinic and all these spaces like global health space, these spaces where you actually affect practice and praxis are sites for changing epistemology and praxis, right?
Mhm.
And a countervailing force to the neoliberal space, or whatever space we want to refer to. Anyway, and then I thought we could end that chapter really talking about, you know, that this book aims to talk about um, uh, accompaniment from from historical roots and epistemology to practice. and
Hmm.
that how it can actually be part of the real world, and it's not, it doesn't require, it requires changing the way we approach these problems, more than anything else. And so that's what I thought, because I don't want people to be like, oh, I can't do that. It's like, so our examples are to show that actually you can do that. You can do that as you teach, you can do that in the way you mentor, you can do that in the way you guide a program at the WHO. There's all these, you can do it in the way you do it in Chelsea over vaccines, and getting people to participate in elections. Like, it's all part of the same thread of how you act in the world and how you see the other. So I thought that could be, and again, these themes are not in the order of appearance. I think they should be there, but I don't know if we can change the order of appearance. But
I mean, the one thing the word that comes to my mind is that to describe part of what you're saying is processual, where wherever the site is you start, there is a lived process between you and whoever you are talking with, being with, whatever, and then that builds on to learning. And as one of the questions that is this innate or can it be cultivated? And this whole notion that you cultivate from within the practice by also triangulating epistemology and ideas, and then the person in front of you will really teach you what matters. And then it's processual in that it then can be carried over to many sites and many levels.
great, that's wonderful. That's a nice framing.
Yeah. And so that is one of the profound things that I've had. And there is um here's a quote from Paul on social suffering. Accompaniment has so many faces that are especially connected to human suffering and alleviating that suffering, whether in service to the infirm and elderly, to people who can't bathe themselves, to where there is no path for wheelchair. It's about stepping in with compassion, love, solidarity, respect, and open-ended commitment.
I like that.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah, yeah. And um, so uh, um, I'll see right here. And this is the business of learning with. That's why I bring all these withs, right? There's so much part of this. When we leave out the practical part of accompaniment, you miss the whole point. Listening to what people say they need and trying to help people get what they need is a huge piece of it. And a lot of times it's very practical, like Joya's example with the pump. And the things they need are very basic to physical well-being. But if you take this part out, I don't think it's accompaniment. That there's a tendency to separate out praxis and epistemology, and weigh one higher than the other. But it's this business that Paul is intertwining, right?
Is this stuff you've written, Arlene?
Creating it right now.
Okay, it's so beautifully put. So, Aaron, I'm glad you're taping it, because we can just capture some of this as paragraphs, like it's being transcribed. It's wonderful. It's great. I think
Yes, that is
that's
why
so
we're
good.
doing this.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's so good. And Arlene, that really then captures. I think that like, I was breaking it down into themes without thinking of how you've put it so beautifully, but it's layered, and I think that the themes can help the students, but the way you're putting it integrates like exactly what they're going to read, and they realize that it's that there's something about the way you're doing it and how you're interacting with the others that actually matters.
And that's the thing, when you are in an interview or in a moment or in the field or whatever, and then you have nothing to say, right? And you say, well, I'm supposed to be doing this, that, and the other thing. I'm supposed to be the expert, blah, blah, blah. And if you just pause and listen to the other person, the way opens.
I don't know if you and I were talking about this the other day, but I think, or Aaron, you, I can't remember which one of you I was talking to, but it was like this thing about, I was reflecting on Kamala Harris, and when somebody interrupted her, some protesters, she said, "I'm speaking now. I'm speaking," right? And it was really interesting because, you could have said, "I hear you. I'm listening. I feel your pain." You could have said a variety of different things other than "I'm speaking," right? To actually recognize the other people's point they're doing. And you don't, and any of those statements doesn't mean that I agree with you. I hear you. I really hear you. right? But she doesn't, none of it, but she actually couldn't say that. And it was just so reflective. And it made me think about this whole thing of what does it mean when you're part of a polity and you're actually even in pluralism, you have to be able to say to somebody, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I hear you. I hear what you're saying, right?
Right.
And so it's just that. And I just think, like, we've had this gap on campus where people don't recognize that, Jewish brothers and sisters have gone through 2,000 years of deep racism in Europe, culminating in the Holocaust, but not the only thing, right? And so fears can be real. It doesn't mean what's happening today is right, but fears can be real. And one has to hear that, right? And I guess that's what I'm looking at. Like, you're right. It's about how you act to the other people. Do I hear you?
Right.
Do I see your point of view, right? And the Levinas stuff that you bring in, Arlene, is great. And Aaron, you allude to the same, the same things. That's why I think it's so critical. And I like the way you're wording it, Arlene, because then it segues into all these ways of understanding well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it in the interview, I was looking for places where we could take segments. So Steve says, so you think accompaniment is something that can be learned and cultivated along the way as opposed to an innate trait. Okay. And so Paul says, absolutely, it's a mistake to think of it as innate, though everyone does innately have the capacity to learn about accompaniment. And this is this processual thing, moment to moment. Do you have the capacity? Can you develop, can you cultivate that sense, what I say, a sensibility, right? I mean, sometimes it's being silence. Sometimes it's just daring to take a deep breath and pause in a situation where you don't have a clue or you have an assumption. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think Gustavo touches on this in
Yes.
on Job, right? Where there's these very poignant scenes, two of which stick in my mind, when the three men come and they sit at his bed and they just cry and are silent for a week before they speak, right? Because they're just recognizing his pain and suffering with in some way. And then the other part is when Job, who's reflecting on his own suffering, speaks to God the second time and talks about the suffering of others, that God responds, that it becomes like the salience of a shared experience, right? And Gustavo doesn't use those words, but God responds because he's talking about himself as part of the collective, right? And God's response, of course, is quite unsatisfactory.
Well, God.
Which is like, where were you when I created the world? So listen to me. But still, the fact that Job is listened to when he speaks of his plight in light of the plight of others is, I think, something also relevant. So Gustavo touches on it
Yes.
in beautiful ways, and of course the Bible. Obviously, this is all in the Bible, so the Bible touches on it in beautiful ways. But it's there, right?
Right. And sometimes it's really hard to articulate it. In my chapter, I referred to this experience I had with this Norwegian philosopher, Arnes, who said, "Oh, I love Levinas, but it hurts my head. I can't understand what he's saying." So he went to Paris to meet him. And he knocks on Levinas's door, and Levinas steps back, gestures, come in, and says, "Après vous," after you. And so Arnez said, I got exactly what he was talking about. Right.
Yeah.
And that's this thing of the Arthur's, the audacity of accompaniment. It's not easy to really let room for the other person and not make assumptions about what they need, what kind of epistemology I should bring in to address this difficult situation. Anyway, but
I'm
so
glad you mentioned Ubuntu, by the way, a bunch of times, because I've always, throughout our times of working in South Africa and Southern Africa, I've always been struck, when the Zulu people meet each other, they say, "I see you," and the other
yes,
person responds, "I'm here." And
yes,
it's such a beautiful thing because people keep saying it, they're passing on the street, and obviously they're not stopping and seeing them, but it's this recognition that you wouldn't just, like we do in America, walk by somebody and not recognize their existence. It fascinates me because it may not be in practice, but it's real.
right. Well, this is all part of the relational thing that Paul keeps coming back to, no matter what. Um, uh, he keeps coming, and that's the humility that's talked about.
Aaron, you wanted to say something?
I did, I'm not sure if this is a diversion from this wonderful conversation, but Steve asked Paul a great question, I thought, or at least a useful one, about tensions inherent in the concept of accompaniment. And I wonder if, that might not be something to, for the introduction to reflect on. I think that
Oh,
what it is, in practice and in this sort of reflection is critical, but also, how it the struggle to kind of elaborate and realize accompaniment. What are the tensions that one experiences as one tries to do that?
Well, maybe a thing to add to that is it depends what you're going in expecting. So if you talk about tensions, then you say, oh my God, I bet like your students, or Steve's, one of your students was saying, well, okay, I want to be good at this. I want to be able to do it. But if you talk about the challenge of accompaniment, the openings for accompaniment, what I was describing is what to do when you're without words, you don't have a clue. And then how do you remind yourself of what Arthur would say, what's at stake and what matters? And that goes back to presence. It goes back to humility. So maybe as part of what you're saying, could we add, what do you draw on with the challenges of accompaniment?
That's one question, I guess, like what makes it hard? What makes it hard to, to engage in this, and what makes it hard to really understand whether what you're doing is accompaniment or something that's not accompaniment, or that is less constructive kind of accompaniment in the way that Salman, mentioned with the Kamala Harris example.
I think that really is a nice lead into the chapters.
I don't know.
Challenges.
It's a nice lead in, but I wouldn't bring it up only because
No.
people, like, she got whatever, a 10-minute standing ovation yesterday. So I just feel like we're on a different, we're the three of us are in a different place than I think the rest of our readers.
But everybody knows what it's like to get hooked. Everyone knows what it's like to just want to have a reaction. And most of the time people are doing that instead of trying to think of what matters here.
But just sorry to go back to the Ubuntu thing. She could have even said, I see you. Don't worry, I see you guys. It's just a
Yeah.
recognition of the protesters, not
Oh
saying
God.
I
Oh,
agree with you. I want her to agree with them.
yes.
But I think there's something that bothered me, that lack of recognition. And Pete Buttigieg did that with a black woman once. She said, Mayor Pete, I can't remember the exact interaction, but she said she went to him and was saying, you did such and such when you were mayor. And he said, she said, why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you responding to me? Like, he was like this far away. And she said, don't you want me to vote for you or something like that? And he said, I don't need your vote.
I'm sorry
It
to
was
laugh.
horrible. You should look it up on YouTube. It's
Awful.
it's so
Awful.
shocking. And this woman, it's a black woman, and she just like looks at him, and she's stunned, right? And I just, anyway, my point is that these are simple interactions where you, like, when somebody collapsed while Bernie Sanders was speaking, he stopped his speech to look to make sure the person was okay. Other people ran up and looked after them, but he just continued speaking as if a human being hadn't dropped to the ground. He looked to make sure that it was okay, and then he continued. So there's
Right.
small gestures. It's a gesture. And
Yes.
Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the opposition in Canada, was censured by Parliament and kicked out for a day because he was talking about racism and whatever in Quebec, and the suffering of people. And the head of the Bloc Québécois just went like this. He went, and Jagmeet Singh said, and again, it's on YouTube. You should watch it. It's fascinating. Jagmeet Singh said, "You're a racist. Don't make gestures like that. And you're not allowed to call people names in the House of Parliament." Anyway, later he was explaining. He said that gesture. There was something about that gesture. It was just that lack. It was just that he didn't care. He didn't even care to acknowledge it. That he didn't have to agree with it. He just didn't even care at all. He said it just made my blood boil. And there is, and our whole lives are those gestures. The gesture of somebody showing you even a little bit of respect and kindness, or somebody just being like, right?
Right.
That those gestures mean something.
And we all have that impulse. like,
Yeah.
I'm a parent, and,
Yes.
I can't think how many times I just wanted to
Yeah.
tell my 10-year-old to just stop. I can't. But, that's the struggle. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a clinician, but I imagine that sometimes with patients that happens too. It's a
With
struggle.
no, but it's everywhere, and it depends on whether you can embrace the possibility of shifting a conversation. If you step back and pause, it's the shift. It's what you might notice in the shift that opens up possibilities for engagement that you didn't notice before. I had a wonderful mentor who said when he's going into complex situations, he thinks of what he will not do. And then that leaves the possibility for all kinds of other things he could do. But see, I think this kind of is a wonderful segue to the cases, to the chapters. You will see in these chapters how people enter into situations, or whatever you want to call it, and notice openings to shift them, and how you can invite in other people, whether it's in your moment of engagement, you then open the way to talk to the community, to talk the community. It can then involve the teachers or the churches, or you're thinking of possibilities of engagement. What I just threw out a couple of lines of I just say accompaniment is intertwined as a relational process to address complex issues, like you're saying. What gets co-created with accompagnators and what matters to them then carries over time to different sites and different stakeholders. Okay. And then we can play with this one. I've done this one before. We invite the readers to walk with us as we offer rich and varied exemplars of accompaniment as constitutive of the process of accompaniment. It resonates with Farmer's emphasis on the importance of examples, which each author, in our chapters, each author offers an event close to them in his or her own voice to write about what has changed them and changed others. It echoes his plea to listen with humility, foregrounding the voices of caregivers. So using part of the introduction as a segue to invite the reader to read these exemplars. And then this is repetitious. These moving narratives track the importance of accompaniment as processual, what is carried over in care, education, learning, partnership, and community, and onto local government and policy. It is an ethical response and moral act, making visible what is at stake to multiple participants. Too many words for a conversation. But
Well,
No,
it
but I
was
think
fine.
it's
I
good.
mean,
I love the
but
we have to be able to
I
edit
get
it.
the point, and I think that it is a good segue into the chapters. I'm
Salman,
gonna
you had some.
Salman, you had
Salman,
some?
you
No, I
had
was just saying that I think it's really nice. I mean, it was long, so in my mind, like, I'd like to see it written so that we can edit it. But it's nice. It's got a lot of key things.
Can I suggest that at this juncture we say a few words about each of the chapters? Or, maybe the summaries are uncontroversial, but it seems like a conversation is a good way of, kind of parsing them out, and relating them to this, more reflective conversation that we just had. Does that sound like a good thing to do to finish up?
Yeah, let's do that because you're right. We're going to have to write something, and this will help us tie in what we've just talked about.
and the purpose of the book.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm just going to pull up the thing. So not in any order.
Yeah, not in any order.
Arlene, do you want to like, would you put like like a thing about, so basically I would say, Arlene, for your thing is a lot of what you've said right now is what comes out of your chapter. And I wonder if we can say, and again, I'm thinking it in my own mind, so please forgive me for grouping it this way, but I would say, you know, uh, Aaron Shakow's chapter, lays out some of the foundation. You can put it anywhere, but we can just put these phrases wherever. Aaron Shakow's chapter, um, deals with some of the addresses some of the thinking behind the accompaniment as Paul Farmer envisioned it, and links to the kind of the idea of a moral frame that emerges both religiously and secularly across numerous traditions. Arlene Katz, brings up the idea of accompaniment as a relational process and talks about the different levels of listening and walking with, et cetera. So like we can pick up like the key points that come out in those two. That's again in my head. I'm packaging them, but they can be unpackaged. We can put those sentences anywhere. Um, I felt like if we tied Joya, Anatol, sorry, let's start with Steve. With Steve is talking about that accompaniment. These ideas of accompaniment are they're like everything in the world that we live in. They're a social construction, so they can be taught, and it's important to teach them because it's important to have people understand the world in specific ways. And we've got lots of forces that describe the world in different ways, and people are yearning because the world as it's described is not the world as it is or should be. So it needs to be taught. And so Steve brings that out with undergrads, and Joya, Anatole, and Fernet, and then to a certain extent Christophe, if we can edit him, bring up how this actually has a bearing in the way you approach clinical practice and the way you approach caregiving to patients, but also how you train people so that they approach research and clinical practice in a specific way. So that's how I would tie in those initial things, and then we can say, and again, not in order. So Greg Carrelas, talks about how understanding people and communities involves, understanding this, like that history didn't just begin last week. There are deep histories that shape the way people relate to each other and relate to power, and those have to be, kind of dealt with, and they have to be dealt with in a humble way where you listen to the community and you understand that there's, this kind of community. I don't know what the word is, Aaron, you've used it before when you talk about community healing, but there's this community kind of damage, for want of a better word, and that there's a process through which that plays out and how we should participate in that. You could say that, then we could say that Keshavji brings up, in the work, even with a state as big as Russia, that it may start with patients because those are the people that are affected by disease, but that, in order to have that accompaniment reach the level where it can affect, that can change the way policies are, and policies are the place where power are enacted. You need to be working with the state and local partners in a way to make that change. I know we can parse that out. And then, with Ellen, we can say that, accompaniment, in listening to the community's voice, there had to be trust, and that trust was not built by just telling them to get the latest care. The trust was built over years of actually engagement with the community at the grassroots, being in people's homes and having them trust you. And then that led to, of course, them seeking certain types of care. And that also led to them realizing that in Massachusetts, the legislature was a place that some of that, where some of these decisions were made, and in the realms of policy, and then engaging with the community and making that happen, so that it happened at multiple levels there. And then same thing with Michael. With Michael is that, there's a political economy to this, and these are the groups that are not just worthy of quote unquote harm reduction in the classic sense of exchanging needles, but that people need care, they need a network, and they actually need things like, housing and food as part of that. And so you can get that, and so that would be the four. And then, so we can just bring that up, and then maybe we can touch on, just to close, Arlene, how this ties from the epistemology and the historical roots and the epistemology that are born from it to praxis, and that, this whole book is trying to show that arc so that people don't look at accompaniment as some abstract concept, but as something with which you build and with you engage in the world. or which with you engage and perhaps build
What,
in the world, build
do you want to
mutually.
make any comments in the introduction about Paul's interviews?
Yes, we should say that, you know, Paul was involved in a book on accompaniment, and that he died before that could happen. And you know, we have, you know, in this book we have two never before interviews with Paul, and or one, whatever, however we package it, and that they actually touch on, and we can talk about some of the key themes that, you know, that Paul picks up all of this and in his own words talks about how he was shaped by this idea, and how this idea has shaped the things that he did in his life to engage with healthcare, and his mentees, and how they shaped his mentees and people that he's worked with, so that, you know, to act in the world.
And maybe that's where the things that Arlene pulled out, you know, can, you know, immediately be inserted, is into the introduction, where we're kind of reflecting on the relationship between what Paul said and what the chapters say. So that might be a really nice way of sort of using those snippets in a clear way without being repetitive.
I definitely think this thing, Arlene, that you said earlier about process and the back and
Perception.
forth, and this is exactly what I was getting at with Christoph's chapter. He's not touching on that as
Or
much.
he's being it and not talking about it. Remember, he's English is his second language. He, by the way, trying to sweet talk people. This guy, Haiti, was under siege and blowing up, and his brother-in-law was kidnapped, and the hospital was attacked. And I'm saying, wouldn't you like to write a chapter?
So he may not have had the time or the bandwidth, and it's not his first language. It may still result in him not being in the book because it doesn't. It
No,
is,
no, I couldn't do that.
or we edit it. We
Yeah,
edit it. Is what,
I couldn't do that after him committing to do it and mucking bullets to do it. I can't say, sorry, it's not good enough. Ah,
so can we put in a section, and again, just tying to the introduction, because I think you've put it so nicely for the introduction about the process of mentorship, the back and forth in there, because I think that's the key part that's missing in his, and I think
yeah,
that's what you get at in the introduction. That Aaron's right. We can talk about Paul's interviews and what he touches on, and then how, you know, and then reflect on this idea of process, that it's listening and acting with the person,
right.
listening to and acting with. And even in the research, that's what I think he's getting at, but doesn't get at fully, is that a true mentor listens to what you want to do and works with you on it in a certain way, and the topics that matter to you. It's
And
not the
Mhm.
topic that matters to you, Arlene. It's the topic that mattered to him.
Right, right. And I think that's what he's daring to get at. It's like Bernie Sanders stopping and seeing if someone fell down. You know, I talked to him when his brother-in-law is kidnapped. You know, it's not, well, we have this this deadline to get your research in. It's a living bit. I was just you know, I really like what you've done, and I was just wondering, you were kind of framing Greg as going into deep history, and I'm wondering if some of Aaron's stuff can be there, where you're talking about the importance of deep history. That's one part of what you're doing. I think
Oh, that's interesting. Listening to histories, and then Greg, and then maybe Ellen. So maybe
yeah,
Ellen and Greg and together,
yeah,
and with Aaron. That's an interesting grouping. Wow.
yeah. And I like the link over to, I mean, I can talk a little bit about um I have notes scattered all over the place here. The only thing that the other thing that I pulled for theme is the example, power of examples. And
Sorry, you went out when you said that. What did you say? The what?
power of examples is in what I sent you also, the themes. Where is, oh, here it is. That, so it's, you know, the practice of accompaniment, and also he makes a big deal about examples and the use of examples. And that's what was going to lay the groundwork when I talk about exemplars, and then Paul talks about I take examples close to my own experience, and the examples of the people in this chapter are varied, but and when we leave out, yeah, okay, so that kind of segue. Did you, I think I would add to. On mine, I would add on how I draw on exemplars again that are constitutive of accompaniment as a relational process. And you know, and carried over. So the whole business of, being in three settings. I don't know if you want to do that, to deal with neonatal disparities in the birth center in DC, and in partnership with the community and residents in a safety net hospital. And all of these were carried over decades. So accompaniment just is carried on, and that's the processual. And I think in the chapters, people talk about what is carried over, the groundwork's laid, and how it's iterative. And then in dialogue, with mine in dialogue, themes are related to epistemology. So bringing in, Kleinman, liberation theology and philosophy. So the book is an opportunity for dialogue across disciplines, across settings, and between epistemology and practice.
And I think that Levinas specifically, because he's a phenomenological philosopher and thinks a lot about this, deals with this question of the relationship between how we know what we know and our relationship with others. And he's very clear on that, and he actually calls it accompaniment in the cognitive sense. So it's I think that's that would be an important point to make in that part. The other thing that I think came out of the first part of this conversation that should ideally be emphasized in the introduction is that the basic concept of accompaniment, as Paul, kind of inherited it, was developed by people who were thinking about accompaniment as effective action, in contrast to the kind of pastoral accompaniment that preceded Vatican II or whatever, that was not effective action. That was just, you come in and you give confessional or what have you. So I think that just this basic orientation toward action and toward figuring out what people's needs are and addressing them as part of your, responsibilities to accompany is very important and should be, kind of noted explicitly as an historical feature.
Right. And the reminder is, whatever Paul was exposed to, he always says he learned about accompaniment in Haiti. The accompagnateurs taught me, and that's exactly the humility. He could have gone in and just quoted a lot of stuff and say, I am doing this, that, and the other thing. And that's the same thing that Joya made with Manzi. First thing they did with Manzi was send him to Haiti to learn from the source.
Yeah.
And then bring it over, and then he could apply it. So this is processual again. And I don't know, I probably have other.
Were there other comments on chapters that you had that weren't addressed by what we said so far?
That's what I was just. In terms of Ellen, as we said before, is bringing in caregiving as an ethical practice, and what gets carried. This whole notion of processual is what gets carried over, and bringing that in, and how it gets leveraged. And so she says, the trust, and
You guys, I have to unfortunately go. I have this
Yeah.
Adams training that starts, and it goes till like 8 tonight, and I haven't prepped for it, so I just have to.
Just a second.
Okay, just one other thing for your chapter, Salman, how you bring in terms of accompanying, multiple levels of accompaniment, the technical, suffering with use of patient accompagnators, and recognize structural violence that allows social space. That you had mentioned in your,
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks.
yeah, so,
You guys, I wanted to also say that, Paul in his thing, if we want to bring some of Paul's stuff in, the stuff that I thought, that just very pithy things that he says accompaniment is both a tactic and a strategy related to
yes,
the goal of health equity, and you can't get there without training, learning, and creating knowledge. So I thought that was really
yes,
important, which explains why we've got the book set up this way. And then
yes.
he's got this other thing that says, he says accompaniment provides a lens to view things and is also a battle cry. Can you have a Muslim travel ban that is a form of accompaniment? Of course not. Can you have an assault on social safety nets that is consistent with accompaniment? Of course not. Can you separate children from their parents at a border and call it accompaniment? No. If the definition of accompaniment is so elastic, then it risks meaning nothing. Accompaniment is not merely an addendum, which I thought, they end the first part with that, and I thought that's, we can refer to that thing, that it really is a battle cry. This is why, Arlene, I'm surprised you took out the word struggle, because this whole fight for justice is an ongoing struggle, right? And the fight for accompaniment in the face of neoliberalism and stuff is a struggle. It is a struggle. It's a fight, and it's ongoing, and it's relentless, and we have to, just, it's all of us working in solidarity.
And solidarity should be in there too. There's so many words that I wanted in there.
We can say this, we can say it in the introduction. Everything doesn't have to be in the title, but we can say it. But
Yeah,
it is a struggle. And in fact,
yeah.
you know how we in the West we say of the TB control, they call it TB control. The Russians say the struggle against TB, Боротся против туберкулеза.
I mean, it depends on, again, what kind of preconceptions you want to put out there, because the chapters themselves are amazing stories of encountering, working with, struggling with the struggle, and then having a breakthrough the other side. So having I agree. And how do you the only other thing we had talked about, which we could probably do an email, is having the last almost epilogue be keep on keeping on, getting permission to use that section would be great way to end.
Yeah.
Or we ask Brian if we can put it in the introduction. We can refer to it and say, at Paul's memorial, Brian brought up X, and we can actually recount it.
I suggest that we defer this in the interest of getting the manuscript out quickly, but we can add it afterwards, would be my vote. But, if you think you can get Brian to give a thumbs up quickly and have the bandwidth to write him, then that's all to the good. Can I stop the recording now?
Yeah,
and just
we don't have to decide on the chapter organization at this point.